The next battle will always be near. As long as you have everything, there will be those who have nothing to fear. And little by little, or maybe all at once, you will lose. Because our future is not yours to choose.
Welcome to Voices of Resistance. You are listening to WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
The viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or the staff.
I'm Barbara Humphrey.
And I'm Albert Strickland.
Co-hosts of today's show. Voices of Resistance is a project of the Savannah Justice and Peace Collective. We give voice to resistors who have no voice in mainstream media and present a wide range of issues that affect us all.
But there will always be resistance. The next battle will always be near. As long as you have everything, there will be those who have nothing to fear. And little by little, or maybe all at once, you will lose. Because our future is not yours to choose.
So welcome to the October 18th edition of Voices of Resistance. Here in the studio today we have myself, Barbara Humphrey,
Albert Strickland,
Phoenix Godwin,
and Savannah Patterson on the board.
She controls everything.
Yes, thank heavens, because we are truly out of control. On our October 4th show, which was 2 weeks ago, we introduced a radical idea to abolish prisons. And last week we talked about poverty as a major feeder of the prisons and what we could do to abolish poverty. Today we're going to talk about another major feeder, the war on drugs. In terms of abolishing prisons, we talked about them being obsolete, about how the U.S. is the major incarcerator in the world, and it's time to separate crime from punishment and look at other ways of dealing with this. And that the prisons and prisoners have become commodified into for-profit for the state and for private corporations. So today, as we talk about the war on drugs, which is really a war on the poor, especially poor people of color and political dissidents, and it's also a means of population control, I hope you'll keep that in mind. I've been an anti-drug warrior for more than 25 years and had the great fortune of attending a drug reform policy conference this past weekend in Atlanta, where we were able to bring back lots of incredible information, and I was incredibly gratified to see all the new faces involved in abolishing this war.
Well, we would like to start off today with actually giving kudos to Alderman Van Johnson, who happens to be our alderman, or at least mine, for his proposal of the decriminalization in Savannah of drugs on Monday, October 16th. I just read it in the headlines in the paper and said, wow, this is really something for Savannah. So the decriminalization of marijuana, it's a good first step toward legalization to end the many harms caused by the disastrous war on drugs, including many things like the spread of HIV and AIDS, through the sharing of syringes, prison sentences without end, and street violence that destroys lives and neighborhoods. Perhaps this will open up a dialogue throughout the city. At least that is our firm hope, that this was the first step, and from here we can move on to actually taking care of the problem.
It's still a long way to go, but it is definitely nice to see this actually come up in within the public discussion, actually talking about changing how we look at our drug laws and how they affect people.
Absolutely.
I was so surprised I had to step back because I couldn't believe that. I read the headlines on the newspaper in the box as I walked by. I said, no, that can't be Savannah. But thank you very much, Alderman. I hope it goes quickly and farther, and we can actually open dialogues.
Yes.
Yeah, follow through on this.
Yes, please, don't drop it. Let's go.
Yes. So, a little bit of history here. The war on drugs is actually started in 1969. It was introduced by President Richard Nixon. In his 1970 State of the Union address, he said about crime, "We must declare and win the war against the criminal elements which increasingly threaten our cities, our homes, and our lives." So he introduced the term war on drugs as part of this tough on crime agenda when he took office.
Which also then he created law enforcement and assistance agency to funnel drug war money into localities, called for condemnation of all unapproved drug use and declared drug use public enemy number one, mounted a national attack on a national problem, but the war on drugs did not start under Richard Nixon.
In fact, we see that the start of this racist war began in the early 20th century, in the 1900s. We have a Dr. Hamilton Wright, who was the first U.S. opium commissioner. Imagine
Wow,
that, an
I didn't
opium
know we had such a
commissioner,
thing.
who made a statement that said cocaine is often the direct incentive to the crime of rape by the Negroes of the South and other sections of the country.
That was in 1911.
Yes,
Yeah.
1911. And then
I remember it well.
obviously I forgot it. One of the most, he also stated, one of the most unfortunate phases of smoking opium in this country is the large number of women who become involved and were living as common law wives or cohabitation with Chinese in the Chinatowns of our various cities.
Wow.
So here we have cocaine and opium associated with two non-white communities in this country, and as a way to demonize them and to take these substances away.
Even though these drugs were definitely used by people of all types.
All types. And then we had the famous Harry Anslinger, who for many is seen as kind of the start of at least the war on marijuana.
In the 1930s.
In the 1930s.
And very, very, very racist.
Very racist. He said, and this is his words, keep this in mind, please, "Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men. There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the U.S., and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others."
Wow.
Wow.
He probably was just upset.
Yes, we won't go there. And then we had the Opium Exclusion Act of 1909, where opium could still be used as medication, but not for any non-medical uses.
The sad thing is that this also actually banned the use of peyote, which was used,
Yes.
of course, by indigenous peoples and Native Americans, especially in the Southwest, in religious ceremonies and things for it's
Yes.
part of their culture.
Now, that was 1971.
Yeah, I know.
skipped
We
ahead.
skipped around a lot.
We skipped around a lot, but just putting it in the perspective of it being an attack, a racist war, and also a war on political dissidents, because in the 60s, in the late 60s, when Richard Nixon declared his war.
Now, those I do remember well.
Yeah, me too. And it was a time of anti-Vietnam War activists who, of course, were known for the use of marijuana, psychedelics, and other substances.
Yes, especially a lot of veterans coming back from Vietnam.
Yes. Yeah. And then there were also the civil rights activists of the 1960s. So you just carry this racist thread forward.
I think of Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah, that's a good one to think of. I agree. There was also an effort during the early 20th century to use these drugs as a source of income. So the Harrison Act in 1914 that regulated and taxed opiates and cocaine. The 1919 Volstead Act that banned alcohol but was overturned in 1933, primarily for monetary reasons, since that was the time of the Depression. And then we had the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act. So if you tried to obtain or use marijuana, there was a very heavy tax on it, and that precluded a lot of poor people from using that drug.
Well, I know we've skipped around a lot of dates, and there are other dates in here, too, that'll be running a whole gamut, but that's just to show how far-reaching this war on the poor, this war on racial war has come,
Right.
it's still going on at this very minute,
Yeah.
and we're in the
Yeah.
2000s now.
That's
so.
right. And actually, all of what preceded 1969, there were these laws on the books, but very little of it was being enforced. It wasn't the hyper war on drugs that started in 1969. And to put yourself in that era, we had a economic recession. We did have the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement. The assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968, the founding of the Black Panther Party in 1966, major civil rights legislation in the 60s, including the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act. And we also had some movements prior to Richard Nixon that actually thought that the way to fight crime was to eliminate its causes. How unique. Poverty, lack of education, and unemployment.
And I'm sure we tested that out that idea very thoroughly and then figured out, oh, that must not work, right?
I'm not sure we ever really got to test it out.
Oh.
I think that giving people the opportunity and freedom, and that would reduce crime, was an idea that never really got much traction,
Why do I keep thinking history had people making sense?
I don't know. I don't know.
Bush Sr., who was responsible for all that?
So,
Well, also it was not as profitable.
No,
as
it
this
certainly
war
wasn't
has
as
been. This war's been a
profitable.
very profitable thing for a lot of communities,
yes,
just not for us people.
that's right. And many people may not have been aware of the fact that Martin Luther King, in his letter from a Birmingham jail, talked about just and unjust laws and said, I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. So when you look at the political climate at the time, and you think about what was happening, and here comes this war on drugs as a war to punish, to imprison poor people of color, and political dissidents. And in fact, we have an amazing quote from Richard Nixon's domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman.
Yeah, in fact, I worked at the club in Seattle where Ehrlichman was arrested. Yes, he was arrested.
He was arrested.
That was part of the Watergate scandal, if I remember correctly,
Yes.
and escorted in handcuffs out of the building.
I wish I could have seen that.
But his quote is quite telling to show that we were talking about earlier about how so much has time. We've jumped around in time, but not really much
Not
has
really.
changed. The quote that was published in Harper's Magazine. Now, Harper's Magazine is a pretty well-known magazine
Yeah.
at that time. And the quote is, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black." These men were very astute,
Yeah.
But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Now that's a direct quote from John Ehrlichman, White House,
Yes, from
Nixon's
the White House.
close associate, yeah.
So really, the war on drugs, as it started in the 60s, was not based on a firm foundation, but in fact was a war on people. There's no question about it. So Nixon got to work right away, and in 1971 he signed the Controlled Substances Act. And we have been living with the results of that ever since. This created a schedule from 1 to 5 of drugs. Schedule 1 drugs were considered to have no medical value and a high potential for abuse. And the drugs that were Schedule 1 were cannabis, heroin, LSD, MDMA, mescaline, peyote, and psilocybin. These drugs were strictly prohibited. There was no purpose in using them. There was no purpose in doing any research on them. It was said that they have no place in society.
So they declared.
So they declared. And by that declaration, these drugs were prohibited. The other...
With heavy penalties
with
if
heavy
you broke
penalties,
their laws.
heavy
yes.
penalties. And then, of course, as we were talking about it today, the irony of the situation is, as the Nixon White House was getting tough on crime and fighting a war on drugs, there were allegations, and if anybody has any more information would like to share with us, we'd love it, about certain arms of the government, particularly the CIA, bringing drugs into the U.S. and into our neighborhoods. Now, we know they did it in the 80s with the Iran-Contra scandal.
We were talking about this in Vietnam,
yes,
so many years
yes,
before that.
Many
so.
years before that.
Air America.
That's right. And for most of the people out there, declaring a war on drugs, being tough on crime, really sold well, particularly in the suburbs where people had fled to get away from those scary inner cities. And, it followed, it continued. Georgia's own president, Jimmy Carter, interestingly enough, actually suggested decriminalizing marijuana.
And she didn't know this before this
I did not know
preparation
this.
for this show.
And I had always, really appreciated Jimmy Carter for so much of what he did and felt that he was really demonized in many ways. And now I understand more and more just why. Because he did stand up to the powers that be.
He even put solar panels on the White House. I
Yes.
mean, he was
Yes.
far-reaching.
He was.
Not
He
that he was
absolutely
perfect.
was.
Oh, of course not. No. And now we know a lot more about some of the things that were hidden in the shadows about him. I mean, it's not as though he was perfect in any way.
Right.
But at least he tried some things. I mean,
Right.
criminalization. Can you imagine that in that time frame? It was
Yeah.
almost
No, it
unheard
was pretty
of.
amazing. Well,
And solar
actually-
panels on the
and
White
solar
House.
panels. And
Come on.
actually, coming out of the 60s, I do recall, it seemed like, at least for marijuana, it was absolutely everywhere. And there was a group called NORML that I really thought, marijuana would be legalized in a few years. But
Normal. What is normal?
NORML. The National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana
Wow.
Laws was an organization, and they seemed to have a lot of traction to be moving forward. And
That was when?
That was in the late 60s, early 70s. And unfortunately, again, the tough on crime, the war on drugs really sold in many places. For those of you that this is all history, the people that were being demonized and targeted with the war on drugs didn't exactly fit into, trying to think, they weren't exactly the Ozzie and Harriets, the Donna Reeds of the
I know
world.
that none of you out there probably know who Donna Reed.
I know you don't.
Oh, that sort of.
Long hair. I don't know. Watch
Profiled
the
people,
movies.
though, are you saying? Wait, what are you
Well,
saying?
what I'm saying is the war on drugs was the war on poor people of color and hippies who were not exactly the people who were being held up as the pillars of society.
Right.
So nobody was really fighting that for the injustice of this. They accepted it. And after Jimmy Carter's effort to try to turn things around, we had Ronald Reagan.
Oh.
And he...
And everything got...
everything got-
No, everything got worse.
so much worse. So much
Everything,
worse.
Yes. Everything started to trickle down, and it wasn't
It
water or
wasn't-
money.
No, it wasn't water or money. His whole campaign in 1980 and then again in 1984 was tough on crime. And this is when we had the federal sentencing guidelines, the mandatory minimums, and we went on a prison binge. Prisons were being constructed. The prison population, as we talked about last week and the week before, grew, and it was the war on drugs that drove a lot of that growth. And the sentences for drug crimes were incredibly harsh. In New York, you had the Rockefeller drug laws, harsh, inflexible penalties after the Attica riot, and that was certainly punishment. And then in 1984, federal sentencing guidelines. And I'm sure you've all heard of the 3 strikes you're out. That was California.
Lock them up, throw away the key.
That's right. Lock them up, throw away the key. So somebody could be caught 3 times with very small amount, relatively small amount of a drug. And if it was your 3rd conviction for a drug offense, you could be imprisoned for life. And
Is it that way in Savannah now? I don't mean for life, but 3 strikes you're out or anything like that? I don't really know.
I don't really know. I mean, the other thing we learned is that the death penalty had been banned, and then suddenly in 1976, it was brought back. So it was a,
I'm
it was
sure
a
not
tough
for
time.
possession of marijuana.
No,
but-
we can hope not.
Yeah.
We can hope not. But once you're imprisoned,
We can talk about though what it is like in Georgia.
Yeah,
Yeah,
what-
we can
what is
talk
it
about
right
what
now?
it's like in Georgia. Well, Georgia has one of the harshest drug laws in the country right now.
Georgia does.
Georgia does.
I didn't
yes.
know that.
I didn't either.
Yes. Possession of paraphernalia, including syringes, is illegal, and some of the most punitive marijuana laws. We do have medical marijuana here, but incredibly limited. All you can get is low-level THC oil for very restricted conditions. And I've talked to some people who say there's a real catch-22. You can't produce it here. You can't cross state lines with it, and so it makes
Well, wait a
it
minute now. If I can't
very
produce it
difficult.
here, and you can't cross
Yes.
state lines with it,
How do you get it? If anybody's listening who has that answer, please let us know, because I'm told it's incredibly
Go to the
restrictive.
Facebook page, Voices of Resistance, and make a comment, provide information, and we'll be glad to report back on it.
There are some things that Georgia is doing right now. There's no criminal or civil liability for possessing a substance called naloxone, which is what you administer to somebody who may have overdosed on an opiate.
In fact, we have a friend here who ran for Congress not long ago who's very big into pushing this.
And getting that stuff out.
That's right,
accessible
getting
to
out.
people.
She thinks everyone should carry it. Police especially does work with training the police and how to use it and that sort of thing.
That's great. I mean, it is illegal here to purchase, possess, or have under your control any controlled subject, any scheduled subject without a prescription. And possession over a certain amount is considered trafficking, which of course is a much higher penalty. What Georgia does have, thankfully, is a Good Samaritan law. And what Good Samaritan law means that if you have overdosed or somebody you know has overdosed, and they can go seek medical care without the police being called in, which is not true everywhere.
Really?
Yeah. An interesting thing that recently happened in Atlanta, we just came back from Atlanta and learned that Atlanta has decriminalized the possession of under 1 ounce of marijuana. They did this month, and it flies in the face of the state law.
And everyone is holding their breath,
Holding their
waiting
breath.
for
Seeing
the
if it goes through.
yes.
Yes,
when this
waiting for the state legislature to reconvene and see if they will overturn that law.
And this
what
is
will
what-
Georgia do.
This is what Van Johnson says inspired him to do, to try to do
Yes.
decriminalization here as
Here in
well.
Savannah.
And once again, I'd
Absolutely.
like to reiterate that I really appreciate
Yes,
opening up this
yes,
conversation.
yes,
Thank you
it's
again, Alderman
Incredibly
Johnson.
important. Atlanta also has established a harm reduction clinic. And what harm reduction clinics do is pass out clean paraphernalia, clean needles, clean syringes to people so they're not sharing. And sharing needles for injection drug users is one way that HIV/AIDS is spread. So Atlanta is really trying to step in and, curb this, deadly disease from spreading. Whether they'll be able to continue to do it, I mean, they're subject to law enforcement if they're caught. So that is Georgia now. And our neighbors to the south in Florida have approved medical marijuana, and I know they're trying to move ahead with recreational use. And South Carolina, we learned, is moving toward, I believe, medical marijuana. So maybe when we're surrounded on two sides, things may change. You never know.
Well, maybe Savannah will take the lead on all of this too and push really hard,
Yeah.
like with Atlanta. and we
Or
can do
Georgia
something.
will just decide to make more money off of all the drug traffic that goes between the legal states.
Between the states.
Well, that's one of the
Maybe I
thi-
shouldn't have said that out loud.
Well, no,
given
that's
many
one of the
ideas.
things I don't understand because these governments, all they're after is money, right? For all these things they can do. But look at the
Yeah.
states that have legalized recreational use, even. I mean, they're rolling in money, it seems,
Yeah,
and you would
that's what
think
we hear. Yeah.
that we would look at that and say, hey, we could get this money too. But
Yes.
we aren't. And
Yes.
I don't understand why yet. But
Oh, actually, that's an interesting thing. That brings me up to something that I thought might be good to talk about a little bit, is the sort of culture war that also is involved with this. Because
Mm-hmm.
when we talk, I mean, even back in the reefer madness days of that prohibition, there was
I
still,
remember those. Though.
Yeah,
and
like
I don't
e-
even use it.
even
myself.
not with well, it still obviously ends up being racist because we're like jazz culture was vilified and
Yes.
associated
Mhm.
with marijuana,
cocaine
and like
cocaine, yeah.
then in the 60s, like the hippie movement, but also I think did we say it's Terrence McKenna
Terrence
who wrote this
McKenna.
book Food of the Gods, which is about the effects of psychedelics on civilization,
Yeah.
like throughout the entire existence of humanity. These sorts of things have changed the way that we perceive the world around us, and it's fair to say that that's not people being open-minded isn't necessarily a preferred thing by the powers that be, because people start to question it. You get, like in the 60s, this huge countercultural movement that came with the release of this easily manufacturable psychedelic substance.
Or easily grown.
But we do know also that it does increase creativity at times, and so when you have the high museums of modern art, is that part of this, the high museum thing, is that part of creativity?
Well, it could be. It could
Culturally, anyway?
So it's not conclusive, but maybe it's something that is one of those things that makes people apprehensive about.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe.
So, as we think about what's happening in Savannah now, we did say kudos to Alderman Van Johnson. He announced his intention to reduce the penalty for misdemeanor marijuana possession, which would basically decriminalize it, make it like a traffic ticket. He's going to present this ordinance within 45 days to the Savannah City Council to eliminate jail time and reduce the maximum fine from $1,000 to $150 for those caught with less than 1 ounce of marijuana in the city limits. And
I'm a proponent of supporting your city council by going to the meetings and that sort of thing.
Yes.
So on issues like this, we should all make our presence known.
Absolutely.
And support
Let him know
these
if
important
you-
things. Yes,
yes,
please.
If you approve of this, definitely. And he's also talked about using a portion of the fines that are collected for treatment for those who seek it. And I kind of
Great.
like the way he said that. Not treatment for all, but for those who seek it.
Yeah.
And we will get a little more into that.
I also just want to say, I really hope, I mean, I don't know if this is possible, but there can be some kind of retroactive basis to this, because usually we get these, like, we change the laws and we've arrested all these people for these minor victimless crimes, but are they just stuck there now still?
Yes.
Like, we now recognize it's a victimless crime, but you're still going to stay in prison for who knows how long? Or are we going to try to fix that and get some of our people out of prison?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know what Colorado did. If anybody knows, or we can look it up and kind of get back to everyone. Did they, when they legalized marijuana, did they release those who were sitting in state?
Van Johnson, if you're listening, think about that.
Yes, really.
Well,
Yes.
do we have time or?
I don't know. Are we ready to identify ourselves? Okay.
Okay.
You're listening to WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. I'd like to let you know that the Savannah Bicycle Campaign's 9th annual Midnight Garden Ride will be held on October 21st, which is this Saturday, I believe, at 7 p.m. The nighttime bike ride is followed by a concert at Grayson Stadium and is the largest annual fundraiser for the nonprofit Bicycle Advocacy Group. More information and registration is available at midnightgardenride.com. So, before we move on, we should tell you you're listening to Voices of Resistance. I'm Barbara.
I'm Albert.
I'm Phoenix.
And Savannah on the board. So we've
Still
been
in control of things.
still in control as we get more and more out of control.
Yeah.
We're talking today about the abolition of the war on drugs, which is a major feeder into the prison system. I believe 25% of all local, state, and federal prisoners are incarcerated for a drug crime.
And the thing is, it destroys people's lives, first of all, because once you've gone to prison, you get the record, the mark. It's very difficult to get a job, to get your life back together.
That's right.
And it depends on the prisons you're in and whether they're private or whether they're state or whatever. More penalties can be attached. But it destroys families, it destroys the community in which we're
That's
living,
right.
and these things should be taken into account. If we're trying to correct a lot of social ills, we can begin with the communities we're in, with the families that we have, and start working together to actually raise people up rather than tuck them away in cubby holes.
That's right.
So,
And
that bothers me.
sometimes these arrests lead to life sentences, and not life sentences the way we think about it. But today we were reading some articles about 3 suicides
Yeah.
in the Savannah jail,
And we didn't go back to this. I want to do this at a
Right.
later time. So we just took what we read in the last few months or whatever it was. And there was 3 suicides, and I'm sure there were more throughout the year in the Chatham County Jail. And the system there is in need of a lot of help, mental
Yeah.
care, and all kinds of things.
That's
So-
right. I think earlier this year we read about a young man who had committed suicide at Rikers Island,
Mhm.
and the
Which they're
conditions
closing
there
Rikers,
are
thank goodness.
horrible. And certainly many other jails and prisons around the country that, ruin people's lives. And then when they come out, they've got a mark on their record when they apply for jobs. I believe it used to be, and it may still be, that you can't get a scholarship to college, a federal scholarship for college, if you've been convicted of a felony. I don't think you can live in public housing.
A lot of people are under the misconception that these are places also where the rehabilitation is an
Yes.
issue. We all know that that is not it. It is strictly punishment, putting
That's
you
right.
away, and keeping you for as long as they can. If it's a private facility, of course, there is an ulterior motive. The longer they keep you, the more money they make. But in public prisons, it's jobs for some people,
That's right.
but also it's a cost that we bear as taxpayers that we shouldn't have to bear. And if they're not going to actually work on rehabilitating a person or giving a person the things they need to come into society and re-enter society in a functional way, then we're just increasing the problems when they do come back because
That's
they
right.
have no new skills or educational levels or opportunities.
Somebody that may have gone to prison for a victimless crime may become desperate enough to, make somebody a victim.
That's right. Or become a victim of somebody else.
That's right.
Right.
So what we're
George
trying...
Jackson was a
George
very good
Jackson,
example.
absolutely. So what we're saying is that the drug war causes more harm than the drugs themselves. We're not here to say, oh, drug use is great and wonderful and everybody should do it. We really do believe, though, that consenting adults should have the right to put substances into their body, to use, and even to abuse if they so choose, as long as they're not harming anybody else. I mean, isn't this what freedom and liberty is all about?
We would think so.
I mean, if you have a problem with people abusing drugs, then maybe think about the societal problems which are causing people to feel the need to abuse drugs in the first place. Oh,
And
that's a deep chord, though.
Yeah,
Or-
that's true.
Yeah, it is a deep
also-
chord for me because, I truly believe that people should have the freedom. You should have the freedom to imbibe alcohol, coffee, smoke a cigarette, and use these Schedule I drugs.
And technically, we all should. And alcohol, it's fine as long as it's not abused.
Right.
You're endangering someone else's life while you're using in a DUI situation. I understand that,
Yeah.
and there should be penalties for that because with this freedom also comes responsibility
That's right.
for each individual
That's right.
person. Some of the problems I have with this is we were talking about it earlier, and I've forgotten what I was going to say. So
We
anyway,
are out of control.
yes, we are.
Well, the thing is that people don't. I mean, law isn't what stops people from doing drugs.
No.
If
No.
people want to do drugs, they're going to do drugs, and they're
Right.
going to figure out a way to get them. And if it becomes a more dangerous process because they're prohibited, then that's because of the fact that they're prohibited. If it was something that was facilitated to be safe and treated in a way that's like, we understand this is what's in the world, let's try to account for it on a realistic basis as
That's
opposed
right.
to just punishing
That's
I
people.
know what
right.
it was. We were talking about alcohol and prohibition.
Yes.
And the dangers of alcohol when it
Oh.
was not in any way under any sort of regulation. And now,
That's
even
right.
with the drugs, what are we doing? We're promoting criminal activities. We're making the real criminals rich.
Right, and they're putting drugs out on the street that in some cases are extremely dangerous and kill people,
Yeah, a
And
lot of the drugs do.
which was true
Yeah.
during Prohibition when
Alcohol.
wasn't. And in fact, Phoenix and I have an interesting, what is it, Amsterdam stories?
Oh,
Well, mine is an Amsterdam story. It's not mine personally, but my son and his partner went to Amsterdam. I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. And they couldn't wait to get into the coffee shops because it was illegal to smoke marijuana in the coffee shops. And what they found is the coffee shops were full of tourists because just like him, the tourists couldn't wait to get in. But the people who live there, when you can get something anytime, any day, it becomes less of a desire of an absolute urge to get this because it's there, because it's always there.
Everybody's always got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting psychological issue.
My experience there was it's so normalized there. like smoking marijuana, but this was actually not a marijuana story, but just a general thing about how differently they view and treat drugs there because it's of its decriminalization. There was a handful of tourists died from sniffing what they thought was cocaine that they bought from somebody, but it turned out to be white heroin. So they overdosed and died. And so what the Amsterdam government did was they were putting flyers out and having these billboards everywhere and like going and with people actually handing out leaflets to people saying, if you get this stuff, like, you need to know this is going on. If you need help, come get help. We will not arrest you. It would always be in really big letters, you will not get arrested for drugs in Amsterdam. And like that's a huge difference, because if somebody felt like they were needing help here and they don't feel, like you mentioned the Good Samaritan law that we have in Georgia, but a lot of places don't have things like that in the US.
And not necessarily do people even know about the Good Samaritan law. And
I doubt anyone here does, for the most part, you know.
I know. And really, I have seen the underage people drinking alcohol underage, and there's this thing of binge drinking. And I've read about kids who, passed out, and their friends were afraid to take them to the hospitals because they were underage, and the kids died.
Well, many of us couldn't wait to get to college, and it wasn't for the education.
That's right. It
was for the parties. That's why they always publish this list each year about the biggest partier schools. And Georgia, University of Georgia is on there. So
Syracuse was up on that list too. And I was lucky because I got to go to a college where the drinking age was 18. So I was,
It used to be 18 in Georgia.
Yeah.
That's not long ago.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, if anybody isn't aware of how the drinking age changed, this is a little story we old people know.
Speak for yourself.
Well, I am. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan told the states, if you want federal highway money, you must raise your drinking age to 21. So he basically used money as a tool.
Blackmail.
To blackmail the states to raise the drinking age. I was living at the time in a college neighborhood. And I didn't realize what was going on at first, but all of a sudden we noticed that a lot of these kids who rented houses in the neighborhood were buying kegs on the weekend. They were charging kids $5 at the door, gave them a plastic cup, and they could drink. When you live in a place where there are zoning laws that prevent a bar from opening up next to you, but here bars were opening up next to you in a different kind of way. And it didn't occur to me until many years later that this was a direct result of the change in the drinking law. Mm-hmm. And so the unintended consequences of things were horrific. And as I said, there were kids who binge drank and died because they were fearful of seeking medical help. So the war on drugs, working against the war on drugs has historically been a libertarian issue, because it's typically the libertarians who want, laxed regulations. They have advocated for freedom.
And we're talking about U.S.-style,
U.S.-style
capitalist libertarians.
Right, not the real libertarians.
Right, this is a fake use of this word, but let's go on.
Yeah. Well, no, I think if you don't support people's political views, I think giving them kudos again for the things that they support that you do agree with, because I think that's important to do. And it's obviously this is catching on, and it's not just libertarians now advocating for getting rid of the war on drugs, and that's a good thing for all of us. And the war on drugs is also a war on poor people. And if you want, I'll give you one statistic. We've tried to get away from statistics, but 33% of all drug offense prisoners are black, but they only comprise 13% of the population.
Strange, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's not
very,
strange when you realize that it is a war on poor people of color. And the policing practices that are used to target and pull into the net poor people of color, we've heard them all, stop and frisk. You drive down, I'm convinced if you drive down any street, whether it be a poor urban neighborhood or a well-to-do suburban neighborhood, if you stopped everybody you saw, course, in a suburban neighborhood, you probably wouldn't see anybody because people don't come out of their front doors much. But if they were outside, you would probably get the same percentage of people testing positive for use or carrying drugs. But that's not where you're policing. You're policing in the inner city, and that's where you're picking people up. And it's a tool.
Or in this
that's
instance,
used.
you're policing in areas full of people of color or people
Yeah.
with more poverty.
Yes.
Right.
And, broken windows policing, which is also a terminology that came along that said, where in a neighborhood where windows are broken, houses are run down, and people are more likely to commit crime. Well, if you police heavily in those neighborhoods, if you stop and frisk people, yeah, that's where the statistics are going to be. And one kind of supports the other. And people are pulled into that net. And it's a very inappropriate thing to do. So
essentially what you're saying is wherever you put police, you'll get arrest, and we've just historically been putting police in places that put
That's
certain
right.
people at a disadvantage.
that's right. And not by accident, by intent. So the other harm of the war on drugs is that it has really prevented the medical community, the research community, from looking at the medical uses of drugs. I have been reading a lot lately about cannabis oil and how it's become, anecdotally, people are reporting its effectiveness in neurological disorders like Parkinson's disease,
Cancer treatment.
People who have wasting syndrome from certain illnesses. Cannabis is effective with that. Years ago, I think it was Montel Williams, I got to meet him. He has multiple sclerosis, and he actually had medical marijuana from the federal government, and I'm not quite sure how this happened, but he did. He couldn't cross state lines with it, though, so when he came to a conference, I think it was in Washington, he had to leave it behind. But, there are medical uses for these substances, these Schedule I substances, but, the National Institute of Health is not doing research on it, so people are suffering these diseases without this potential treatment.
Right. So this is where capital interest becomes involved because, for example, I know that psilocybin is supposed to help put OCD in remission, but these are this will eventually get tested as people work very, very hard to get the certain permits and licenses that they need. But in the meantime, there's pharmaceutical companies that are selling probably not as good
Yes.
stuff that's probably not as good for you for
That's right.
very high
That's
amounts of
right.
money.
So instead of going out for your Xanax or your Ambien,
Right.
perhaps you could sit on your couch and use
So then
cannabis.
would that mean that it'd be probably a good conclusion that some of these companies or others like it lobby towards politicians to make it so these drugs stay illegal?
I think that would be a good
I think you could
conclusion.
safely
I think
bet
you
on
could-
that. And I'm sure that the bank account of a lot of
That's
these
right.
public servants we have can prove it if we could get into
That's
it.
right.
Actually, I know for a fact that we can say that about the marijuana prohibition. There was a
Yes.
lot of companies that
Yes.
were specific, but that's anybody
Right.
who cares about weed knows about
And
that.
particularly marijuana because it is relatively easy to produce, to
Right.
grow. And
Well, I read 2 days ago, because I brought
Yeah.
it to your attention too,
Yes.
that the psilocybin
yes,
could actually reset the brain for people who are chronically
yeah,
depressed.
yes.
It just it's like it helps make everything better for you. And you can think of the many psychologists and psychiatrists who would lose a lot of money if that were.
And the pharmaceutical
Possible,
companies,
yeah.
it must be $1 billion business. The,
Right. And if we were
antidepressants.
using hemp oil for things,
Yes.
then and all the things
Yes.
that can produce, then a lot of very
And
powerful industries lose money as well.
The society we live in today is a very depressive society, so
Yes,
we're
it
all
is.
suffering in one way or another
Yes,
from
it is.
depression. So
Yeah.
it's
And speaking of hemp, there's an interesting story about hemp. So hemp is a plant that can be used for so many different things.
ropes,
for
clothing, building materials.
So during World War II, they, marijuana at that point was not a legal substance, not as scheduled as it was under the war on drugs, but they decided to kind of put those laws aside and allow hemp to be grown for rope during the war because they needed rope so desperately.
Wow.
Wow. Yeah,
That's
pretty
convenient.
amazing. Isn't that convenient? And then you just go back to enforcing the law once.
George Washington grew it, didn't he?
Sure.
That was a thing.
Yeah.
It was a big thing
Yeah.
back then.
Yeah.
I mean, the 1700s,
That's right.
hemp was a major plant.
I bet Benjamin Franklin smoked a
Hemp-
lot of weed.
Oh,
Hemp-
he did a lot of strange things. He was
They
quite
did
a
lot of
character.
strange things. But hemp
Yeah.
is a weed. So if you wonder why sometimes one of the nicknames for marijuana is weed, it's a weed. It grows quite profusely. So, you know, the other issue, of course, as we already said, is by this strict scheduling of drugs, by these harsh laws, by not allowing drug paraphernalia, we are also making it possible for certain diseases like HIV, AIDS, and hepatitis to spread. And so many people are suffering because of that. And also preventing people from seeking medical attention if they've overdosed on illegal drugs. It also encourages the militarization of the police. When you think about the SWAT teams are mild compared to what we see these days, but the people busting into homes, sometimes getting the wrong addresses, the harm they're putting people in, the people who've been killed or injured because of these busts.
Not just in the U.S., but also outside
Right.
of the U.S. by us.
Right. right.
SWAT teams in particular, because I just want to make this one little statement. SWAT teams, the first time I ever heard of SWAT teams was on a program on television called Hill Street Blues, when the police department in New York was trying to develop this SWAT team theory so that they could do with hostage situations. And so it
Okay.
was very, very extreme situations. Now I understand with these MRAP vehicles the government is supplying local police departments, they're actually doing things like delivering warrants now. And you've got
That's dangerous.
four parking tickets, and the next thing you know, SWAT shows up with the choppers and the lights and
my
the
God.
battering rams. And
Unbelievable. The other interesting thing that I learned in doing the research for this show is the issue of political power. So most prisons are built in rural areas, rural white areas, and the prisoners predominantly are people of color. So when you take people out of their primarily urban neighborhoods and put them into prisons in these rural areas, for the purpose of the census, they are counted as living in these rural areas. And you
Really?
use the census to determine congressional representation. It's used as a way to
It's basically
political power.
gerrymandering, but
That's
with
right.
prisons.
That's right. So I didn't even realize that until I had read it and thought, oh my goodness, you're right. That's exactly what's happening. So the urban areas are losing their political punch because they're losing population, and these rural white areas are gaining them. So yeah, that's another way to disenfranchise people and make it even harder on them.
effective, too.
And very effective. So, as we talked about with prisons and with poverty, reform versus abolition, which is one of my favorite topics.
Yeah, especially since we're talking about the abolition, basically.
That's
we're not
right.
talking about
That's
reform,
right.
because reform really doesn't do anything except
No.
make a lot of rich people a little richer.
That's right. It doesn't stop the harms.
No.
You reform laws, and I don't mean this as a negative in terms of what's being proposed here for decriminalization, because we're all very excited that the conversation will start, and I am particularly hopeful that, if we at least stop demonizing the drugs.
We're certainly going to push it any way
We
we
will
can,
push
that's
it.
for
We
sure.
will push it.
This is an opportunity I'm not going to let go.
Yes, but I know for me, I'm really a drug legalizer. I have to say that, because I see the harm that the drugs do, and I don't see reform taking the drugs off the street, particularly drugs other than marijuana.
Reform is like a carousel. We
like
can all relate to being on the sense that we're on this crazy machine that's taking us for a ride up and down and in circles, and we want to get off. And people keep thinking like, "Oh, well, we'll fix it. We'll make it
Yeah.
nicer. We'll
One
make this
more ride
carousel
around."
better."
Yep.
And the next time we go around, it'll be better. Get off of the carousel.
That's
Stop
right.
reforming
That's
it.
right.
Just get off and drive away.
And certainly, I'm sure there are places that started with decriminalization and then moved to a legalized structure.
Isn't the process basically medical and then decriminalization and then
Yes.
legalization
And
and
that-
recreational?
Yeah, that seems to be the process as well. You get the medical and you realize you're really not, you really haven't opened the door to reefer madness. And then you can move on to say, well,
Cheech and Chong would be unhappy.
Have you seen that movie though?
I
Reefer
have seen
Madness?
Reefer Madness, and it is
Yeah.
quite
There's actually some pretty nice
Comical.
cinematography in
Yes,
there, and there
yes.
is some really funny scenes.
there are. It is quite comical, I will agree.
Worth watching for a historical anecdote for any of you.
That's right.
That
Take
weren't
it-
around during those days.
Oh, it did. It did. I mean, basically, the premise of Reefer Madness is you take one toke and it's the gateway drug to hard drugs.
People end up dying. There's a court case
Yep.
with where the jury is looking at the switch that you would pull for a light, like a ceiling fan, and the shadow turns into a hanging noose, and the juror is really uncertain if he's okay with condemning a person to death over this. All absurd, just ridiculous thing that started all because somebody had to take a toke.
That's right.
A lot of
That's
these
right.
things are like the gateway drug. If
Gateway.
you smoke marijuana, next thing you're going to be snorting coke and all
Right.
this sort of stuff, which is nowhere near the truth. It is
Right.
not true at
well,
all.
what's the first thing that we learn to drink? Milk. Is that a gateway drug?
Oh, that's the. Oh, yeah.
You got it? You got
I
that?
just got that one. Yeah.
Okay, good.
We were talking about that earlier because, in a way, they kind of created their own self-fulfilling prophecy because they tell everybody, marijuana can, they'll say, oh, it's addictive. They'll even tell you it can cause death, even. And they'll tell you all these things that are so overblown. And so when people end up trying marijuana the first time and they go, wait, they lied to me about this. What else did they lie to me about?
That's right.
And that's something that they created.
And I think that's what happened in the 60s.
Yeah?
Once we realized we'd been lied to about that, you really started looking at things much differently.
We did talk. Yeah, we did talk about the money being made by these private prisons because of these
yes.
drug laws and
Yes.
and things. And now that the handwriting is on the
Yes.
wall about it may be coming to an end in the near
Yeah.
future,
Yep.
they have altered their vision and have gone in another direction. And you learned about this a little bit this
Yes,
weekend.
at the conference in Atlanta, I learned about the treatment industrial complex. So,
I'm so tired of these industrial
Oh, my
complexes.
God. So
It's giving me a
basically-
complex.
right, the private prison providers are now looking at going into civil commitment and psychiatric care facilities, subcontracting to do prisoner mental and medical care, and to do community corrections, treatment, and other kinds of programs. And in fact, today we learned that with the Chatham County Jail, its provider is a private for-profit entity.
Right. Apparently, they have a lot of difficulty with the health services that they
Right.
privatized, and so it's not coming from the sources that
Right.
it once did. And so these private companies are not living up to their end of the bargain, and the prisoners are not getting the health care. And I know that even from Occupy. We had someone who was arrested at Occupy. Not for anything
right.
he really did that was wrong, but anyway, spent 2 weeks in jail and begged to see a doctor. He had a staph infection.
Yeah.
They would not let him see
No.
a doctor at
So,
all.
yeah, that's right, because these private companies are coming to cities and counties and states, and they're saying, we can do this better for less. Now, you just have to do the math. If
Well, they got
can
the for
do
less,
it for
but-
less and still give their shareholders a profit, they've got to be cutting something. And basically what they're doing is they're cutting staff, they're cutting
Well, you heard the thing that
care.
we read about the Chatham County Jail.
Yeah.
What was it? 21 people in the infirmary, 6 people on suicide watch, and one person.
One person.
It's really-
one person. So, yeah.
It's really hard to conceive of this because there's so much with all the privatization that happens within the medical complex. We see a lot of people not getting what they need. So when we're talking about communities that are actually already disenfranchised, people that are drug users, which are already vilified, or people which are in prisons, which are of course already vilified, what are the odds they're going to get the help that they need through private
right.
companies?
That's right. And not only were they going to get their help, but if you're sentenced, for the most part, other than a 3 strikes you're out kind of law, you're sentenced for a low-level drug offense. You'll get a year, maybe you'll get 5 years. I think Georgia, the minimum is 5. But your 5 years end and you're out of jail. But you imagine being a for-profit running a mental health facility. Are you ever going to say, oh yeah, this person is clear to leave and go out in society, when that person in that bed is money in your pocket?
I imagine it's very easy to imagine that the only people that would be able to get out when they're supposed to is people who have resources and friends on the outside
Absolutely.
that can
That's right.
make sure it gets
That's
done
right.
And that's certainly not the poor.
No,
Right.
it certainly isn't. It certainly isn't, especially when somebody gives you a lot of medical jargon and jingo and other kinds of stuff. So it's really frightening to think about, as we reform our prisons, that we will have this new monster to be dealing with. And it's happening, and we know it's happening, and we know it's happening right here in Chatham County. So, and not with good results.
Well, maybe during this discussion that's coming up about
Decrim.
about Alderman Johnson's proposals, we can start taking these issues to task and really start working on finding correct solutions that will help everyone and help the
Right.
community and build Savannah up
Absolutely.
rather than tear us down.
Yeah. So if I've already convinced you that reform doesn't work, and the only thing that will work is abolition, I know people may be sitting there saying, what are you saying? You're saying legalize all drugs? What do you mean? They'll be everywhere. They'll be everywhere. And my first response is, they are everywhere.
That's right.
We're talking about a regulated system like alcohol. And we only have to look to alcohol to see that regulated system.
There are countries that have done that. Portugal is one, and that was brought out in the Michael Moore movie
Right.
about where to invade next. And I was speaking while Barbara was in one of the conferences. I was talking to one of the attendees who runs one of these professional counseling services, and he said there are problems there, but there's problems that they can handle. Ours we
Right.
can't. And he was actually being pulled, whether decriminalize or legalize, and what right do you have to force someone into a drug treatment if they
Right.
don't want to? So
Yeah.
these are the questions that we're all going to have to face and overcome.
That's
and hopefully
true.
we will, and hopefully under
Hopefully
the
we
lead
will.
of our
Yeah.
new city council and our old
Yes.
city council coming together, we can start the it's only a beginning. Start this conversation.
Yes,
so we
start
can
this
all talk about it.
conversation and have a conversation about the harms of the war on drugs, not the harm of the drugs,
That's right.
because that's what's really important.
This is the most exciting thing I've seen out of City Council and
Yeah.
Absolutely.
maybe
Yeah.
ever. I'm very excited to see. It's very, very proactive.
I've attended these meetings, and believe me,
Oh,
this is really
They're
something
boring.
that promises
Yeah.
to make some difference in Savannah.
Yes. So how are we? We good on time? A minute.
Okay,
So
I-
before we get to that, what I would just like
Uh-oh.
to say is think about what legalization would look like. Sit back, close your eyes, and imagine imagine a drug-free world without a war on drugs. Think about what you'd like to see it look like.
We're just a world without a war on drugs.
How about the war without any war?
Yes.
Period,
a
you know?
world with no war.
I'm one of
Imagine
these
that.
people that are kind of opposed to war
Yes,
in general, so the word scares me.
I know. So you have some announcements? to
Yes, I have
us?
two announcements to make. One, a friend of ours, Laura Shadley, indigenous in Savannah, and was at Standing Rock we were at Standing Rock together, has a new show starting tomorrow at 4 p.m. on WRUU 107.5. Please listen. Her special guest is I wrote it down here. She has a special guest anyway, and it's going to be about Kill the Indian, Save the Man,
Okay.
the schools, the residential schools, and the harm they've done.
That's great.
And then on the 22nd at the Sentient Bean, there will be a movie that she will show, and it's also on the residential
Schools.
Indian schools.
Right.
And it's called Cheney Story. And it's about Cheney, who ran away from one of the schools to go home, and the death. And the proceeds from it, there is going to be a $5 donation. I'm sure if you don't have it, don't worry. But and the donations will go to the Gord Dow and Cheney Wanachek Fund.
And I think that's all the time we
So
got.
do we have to
That's it
sign
already?
off? We're
Yeah.
done? Oh, my
They
goodness.
was a good
need
show,
another
though.
hour.
Yeah. We need more time. Thank
it's
you all
perfect,
for
though.
listening.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Next week, the war on truth tellers.
That's
War on truth.
Yes, the war on truth. And
We're
it's
gonna
a very
dig in.
important war. I hate wars.
Yes, and this is one to be
This is
abolished.
one that we want.